here with Professor Kerry Muhlestein, Professor of Ancient Scripture, Brigham Young University, PhD in Egyptology from UCLA.
Yep.
You came to Brigham Young University many years ago by way of University of BYU Hawaii,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm.
You're the director of the, it's a program in Egyptian archaeology.
Yeah, the Egypt excavation project. So I direct the excavation in Egypt. So
Excellent.
yeah,
And thank you for coming today to talk about the Book of Abraham.
my pleasure.
One of the simplest, least controversial topics in the church at the present
Yeah.
moment, right?
Yeah.
So let me begin, I hope, with a simple enough question. What is at stake in the controversies surrounding the Book of Abraham?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. In some ways, not much in some ways, and in some ways a lot. So some of the issues that we debate and we argue over in the end really don't mean that much. But for some people, what's at stake is whether Joseph Smith was an inspired translator or not. And that then calls into question not just the Book of Abraham, but the Book of Mormon, and at this point you're getting at the foundations of Mormonism.
Right. So what are the most compelling arguments against his capacity as a translator?
So most of this comes, I would say there are two of the biggest arguments. One of these is an assumption that people have made, that the fragments we now have, because Joseph Smith had a lot of fragments of papyri, well, he had 2 rolls and some fragments of papyri. We now have 11 of those fragments. The rest burned in the Great Chicago Fire. Yeah. And one of those fragments has the original that facsimile 1 is a facsimile of. So many people, when these resurfaced in 1967, made the assumption that the hieroglyphic text on either side of that is what Joseph Smith was translating from. And we've since developed the ability to translate Egyptian, so we translate it, and it doesn't
match.
Yeah, it doesn't say anything about Abraham or anything, right? So if that assumption is correct, then that really does call into question Joseph Smith's ability as a translator. But it is an assumption until we test it, and there are a number of ways of testing it, and we don't have to get into all the complexities unless you want to, but it's fairly demonstrable that it's not a safe assumption, and even that it's an incorrect assumption. So that's one of the things that argue against it, right? And the second one is the explanations of the facsimiles.
Which is a little more intractable as a problem, isn't it? Or do you have a different opinion?
Well, in some ways, again, it depends on what your assumptions are. So, Joseph Smith explains things about the facsimiles. He doesn't actually claim to translate the glyphs, although he says he knows what they're about.
So you're putting a lot of weight on the differentiation between translation and explanation.
For the facsimiles, yes. Yeah. Because, I mean, he says there's not much text in most of them, but in facsimile 2 there's some text, and he says it's about these things, right? And actually, if you translate them, they are really similar to what he says they're about. But most of what he gives us is an explanation of the meaning behind these, right? So if you assume that Joseph Smith is giving us the same interpretation that an average ancient Egyptian would have given us, then that becomes problematic, although it shouldn't if we were even more careful, because we don't actually know what ancient Egyptians thought they meant. We just know what modern Egyptologists like myself think they mean, right? And in that case, they don't match up most of the time with how we would typically interpret those. Now, if we look at them more carefully, we'll see that at least for facsimile 1 and 3, there are some key differences. These are not like they're unique. And I've long been able to say that about facsimile 1. I've had a master's student just finish a comparative analysis of facsimile 3, and I feel confident in saying about that as well. They're fairly unique, and so I don't know that we can give them a standard interpretation. But I'm also not even sure that's the question we should be asking. Do we know that Joseph Smith was trying to tell us this is how an average ancient Egyptian would have seen it? Is he telling us this is how a Jew would have reinterpreted it? Because they certainly did reinterpret Egyptian things, right? Is he telling us this is what we should get out of it? Is he telling us there were a group of priests in Thebes who were taking Jewish things and intermixing it with Egyptian religion? Is that how they would have interpreted it? Is it some other thing he's telling us? In the end, we don't know. So all of our questions, and this is what I find consistently in Book of Abraham research, that we're typically basing our questions and research on assumptions, often without looking carefully at what those assumptions are.
Okay, so so you would reject the claim that we have evidence that definitively establishes that Joseph Smith failed as a translator of Egyptian.
Yes, I would reject that.
Do you believe there are alternative ways of thinking about Joseph and his prophetic capacity that do not rely upon him being a successful translator of Egyptian in this case?
Yeah, I think that there's a possibility that he's not giving us anything that's on the papyri at all. So if we look closely, one of the ways that we talked about this assumption that people have had that he's translating the text that's on the papyri fragments, and one of the ways I've investigated that, others have as well, but I think I've looked into it more carefully than anyone that I'm aware of. If you look at the eyewitness accounts of people who saw what Joseph Smith was working on or heard him talk about what he was working on, they all agree he's working on the long roll, which we don't have anymore. But that also makes it clear that Joseph at least thinks he's translating from the papyrus that he had. But it is possible that he is the papyrus, as he looks at it, it opens him up to inspiration and revelation, much the same way as we get the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, where he's looking at an English King James version of the Bible, and suddenly he's opened up and he's giving us things that aren't in there at all. That could have happened with the papyri, and he's looking at it, and he's opened up to inspiration and receiving things that are authentically from Abraham, and maybe with redactors and all the things that happen in ancient documents, but authentically from Abraham, but aren't on the papyrus. In which case, then we have to ask ourselves the question, so what does that mean? Was he mistaken about what was on the papyrus? And that's possible, and I don't know that God would feel the need to disabuse him of that notion. In the end, I don't know.
Well, it sounds to me like we need to, and maybe the problems, the challenges of the Book of Abraham present us with an opportunity to re-examine what we thought we knew about the nature of translation, what translation means, how it operates in the case of a prophet. But it seems to me that this isn't a kind of last-ditch effort to salvage a crumbling paradigm as much as it forces us to re-examine what we thought we knew from the very beginning and got wrong. For example, there's a sense in which it doesn't really ring true to call what Joseph Smith did with the Book of Mormon a translation.
That's right.
For the same reason.
Yeah, or with the Book of Mormon, the Parchment of John, the New Translation. That's what he called what we call the Joseph Smith translation. He called it the New Translation of the Bible.
Right.
None of those would fit what we traditionally think of as translation.
So he's channeling, he's producing, he's revelating.
Yeah.
But it brings to mind also the Article of Faith, which talks about the Bible being the Word of God so far as it was translated correctly, but when you study the whole corpus of Joseph Smith's references to the Bible and its inaccuracies, it sounds like what he really meant there was something closer to transmission.
I would agree. I think he primarily meant transmission when he said that. He uses the word translate to encompass all sorts of things. And honestly, I don't know, when you look at either the Book of Abraham or the Book of Mormon, the person who seems to say the least about the translation process is the only one who knew what it was, and that's Joseph Smith.
Right.
And there are times where I ask myself, I wonder how much he fully understood the process he was involved in. This is a gift from God, and I'm not sure that Joseph fully understood how God was interacting with him. He just knew God was interacting with him.
Well, it strikes me there's an interesting echo there of the Apostle Paul when he says, whether in the body or out of the body.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Sometimes we're the least accurate interpreters of our own spiritual experiences. Let me ask you this question. Do you think it's true to say that at the present moment the Book of Abraham provides more obstacles to faith than avenues to faith? And is that a condition or a circumstance that we can in any way alter?
So, kind of yes and yes. So I would say for some people that is true. For some people, the Book of Abraham becomes a great obstacle to faith. And for some it's not. And the difference between them, I think, is the answer to your second question. It seems to me that if we focus on the issues surrounding the Book of Abraham, the controversy, how does Joseph Smith end up with it? What is he really translating? What's his translation method? How does it match with what Egyptologists say? And those are worthwhile questions, right? I'm an academic. I actually love those questions, and I have a lot of fun if I'm just immersed in the research of them and trying to understand. For me, the Book of Abraham is an opportunity to try to understand Joseph Smith and the ancient world better, and understanding one helps me understand the other and vice versa. And so that's good fun. but it's probably not what should be our main focus. For those who focus on the text of the Book of Abraham, then I think that the story becomes less of how we got it, becomes less of an issue, and they open themselves up to that confirmation that what's in there is true. And so we can argue all day. And honestly, I mean, I do this. I sit down with all the little issues, and I say, okay, how would someone who doesn't believe Joseph Smith is an inspired translator look at this evidence? And how would someone who does look at this evidence? And you can make a fairly decent case for both. Now, I happen to think that most of the time the evidence leads towards the believing side. But in the end, I'm actually convinced that all of the time, I can't find a single theory that can account for all of the evidence from either side. And that's not surprising, because in the end we're dealing with God. And we shouldn't be surprised if when we're dealing with God there are lots of things we can't understand, right? And in the end, that's really the point. When we look at the text, we open ourselves up to receiving help from on high, and that's when we can understand things that are beyond our own mental capacity to understand. That's when we'll learn, and that's when the Book of Abraham is a vehicle to faith rather than an obstacle to faith.
Right. Let me back to the question of translation itself.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been struck by the fact that Joseph once referred to the three branches of his calling. And those branches were the translation of the Book of Mormon, mm-hmm. the new translation of the Bible, and what he called the commandments, or Doctrine and Covenants,
right.
presumably. So these other three canonical works, Joseph highlights as specifically delegated to him in his capacity as a prophet, seer, and revelator. Do you agree that there seemed to be a series of stark contrasts in the way he referred to his work as a translator and revelator in those three regards, and his work with the Book of Abraham? Insofar as he never referred to it as a branch of his calling, he engaged in a kind of academic study, both of Hebrew and of the Egyptian that he found on the papyrus scrolls. Right. He never made any claims, as far as I can detect, to call what he was doing scriptural production. Right. So it's not canonized until 40 years after his death.
Right.
So what do you make of those differences?
It's a great question, and I think you're right that it falls a little bit in a messy middle, we could call it, where there are times it's clear that he is considering his work with what he would call the ancient records, which is often how he referred to the papyri, on a par, and as even caught up in his work on the new translation of the Bible. He would talk about wanting to work on them together, wanting, when he asked for help in publishing, it was for publishing both. And so it's clear that in at least some ways in his mind, those two are co-equal. But you're absolutely right that his approach to the Book of Abraham is in at least some ways essentially different than his approach to at least the new translation of the Bible and largely the Book of Mormon. Although even with the Book of Mormon, we have some decent evidence that after translating it by the gift and power of God, which is really all he tells us about his translation process, that he or some of those working with him were trying to reverse engineer some Hebrew out of it, right? So he did see it as a way to try and look at some ancient languages, and he has this thirst for ancient languages. Everything about the restoration for Joseph Smith is not about, it's actually even less about tying into early Christianity, though he certainly does that, but tying even further back to Abraham and Adam. He has this constant quest to tie us back to the most ancient aspects of God's revealed religion. And so language is a part of that for him, the Adamic language and Hebrew, and he sees Egyptian tied up with that, and many people in his day did. Egyptian and Hebrew were ways of helping to understand each other, even though they didn't really understand Egyptian at the time. Even Champollion could translate some things, but not really fully translate. And so I think he approaches the Book of Mormon a little bit with that in mind, but by the time he gets to the Book of Abraham, he has a lot of that in mind, so that he is going to
almost
see
student first and prophet second.
Yeah, or maybe the other way, but they're so integrally combined, it's difficult to disentangle that, right? So, I mean, the first thing we have once he gets the papyri is that he translated some pages, and he reads leaves is the phrase. He reads leaves, or has Oliver Cowdery read leaves the day after he first looks at the papyri of his translation. But he's then almost immediately working on a grammar, right? And so somehow those two are entwined in his mind. And sometimes I feel, as I look at this, sometimes I feel like I'm getting a beat on how it is, and then I'll encounter something else and I say, oh, I don't understand how they're connecting his mind, and then I do, and then I don't. It's a complex thing that I don't think we fully understand, but I think we can be confident that Joseph Smith saw, understood he had an ability to translate as a gift from God, but also wanted an ability to translate in the traditional sense of translation,
right.
And that those two were somehow intertwined and somehow separate at the same time in his mind, and he was going to work at learning to translate in the traditional sense.
Okay, two more series of questions for you. First, what do we know and what do we think we know but really don't about the Kirtland Egyptian papers or the Abraham Egyptian papers?
And yeah, because they're both Kirtland and Nauvoo, but yeah, mostly Kirtland, but some Nauvoo era. That's a really tricky matter. And you asked me at the time, I mean, I've just spent the last 6 months really intensively going through those things. And I would say that most things we don't know nearly as well as we think we know. And I'll include the new publication, Revelations Volume 4 is magnificent, magnificent work. But as I read the footnotes and the assumptions in there, I think there are a lot of assumptions that the authors either recognized or didn't recognize, but I don't think we can safely make those assumptions. And I've since looked at my own work, and I've seen assumptions that I made that I didn't recognize that I made, right? There are a lot of things in there that are based on assumptions. So I would say this, we understand that they are somehow related with the translation of the Book of Abraham. The nature of that relationship is not completely clear. As I said just a moment ago, it seems to be pretty clear he translates first and then starts to work on a grammar, and I think that we can see a pattern of it consistently going that way, translation, grammar, translation, grammar. But there are some areas where we don't have enough data to know that for sure. Where we do have the data, that's the pattern. There's a big chunk of time we don't have a journal or anything else, and so I don't know for sure. But even so, it's also clear that he's working with Oliver Cowdery and W.W. Phelps, and it seems pretty clear this is a largely Phelps-driven project. And Phelps was fascinated with languages and did all sorts of crazy things with languages, and I mean crazy, right? So, and they've been working on the Adamic language even before they start working, before they get the papyri and start working on the Egyptian stuff that they're doing. And it's very clear that those two projects are tied together. And that's part of what makes it hard to figure out what's going on, because I think they're operating on some premises that we don't recognize and we don't understand. And so it makes it very difficult to tell. So the most I'm willing to say we know for certain is that there is a relationship between working on the papyri and working on the alphabet and grammar. And beyond that, we can make some pretty educated conclusions even. Sometimes guesses and sometimes conclusions. But we need to be very aware that that's what they are, and we really don't know. And just be a little more tentative,
more
I think,
muddy
in
waters.
Our language. Yeah.
Okay, last question for you, which in some ways is more a question about culture than Egyptology. My biggest personal surprise in researching the book that I recently published with Brian on the Pearl of Great Price was to learn that in 1913, after a slew of Egyptologists just absolutely demolish, in their minds, Joseph's claims to be a translator, the church publishes 12 responses in the Improvement era of 1913. Everybody who was anybody in Mormon intellectual circles.
Witzel, Sodhall, everyone.
B.H. Roberts, yeah.
Yeah.
So here's my question. The common thread in these responses, B.H. Roberts and Shodall in particular, the common thread is, yeah, he probably didn't know how to translate Egyptian. He probably does fail the test. But that doesn't matter, because what we have is inspired scripture. So I found it almost incredible that all of these Book of Abraham wars that we're going through now, we're reliving an issue that in 1913, the brightest lights in the LDS church thought, this isn't really a problem.
Yeah.
Because, as we've been saying here, we don't really know how revelation works, and apparently he wasn't translating, he was revelating. It didn't matter. It didn't seem to throw anybody. We have no indications that I can find in the historical record of any kind of faith crisis or exodus from the church. They took it in stride. In fact, what I loved was that was it John Evans, one of the writers, actually publishes some of the most excoriating, right, takedowns, and says, but this shows that we're open to all truth and knowledge, wherever it comes from, even critics of the church.
Yeah.
Here's my question. Why, 100 years later, is it creating greater problems for the membership of the church? That what's changed? That it wasn't an issue then and it is now. We haven't learned anything new about Joseph Smith's successes or failures as a translator in the intervening century.
Yeah, I think, and so first of all, let me say I don't know, but I have some ideas. They're just my theories. I don't know, but you're absolutely right. Some of it, I think, is that we've, as a society, become increasingly secularized, and as we become increasingly secularized, we become increasingly, I don't know, fascinated or devoted to scientific principles and so on. But I think that has made it more difficult for us to say, okay, there's something about this that doesn't make sense, but I'm okay with things not making sense. We want everything to make sense. And I think that's exacerbated by the second problem. We often talk about living in the age of information, right? There is so much information available, and we feel like, and I think even as members of the church, we've somehow gotten to the point where we feel like we should be able to answer every question. We should be able to explain everything and answer every question, which again, I think is a little foolish when you really think about the fact that we're dealing with God. Right? If I could understand everything about God, I'd be kind of disappointed in who God is, right? I mean, not that much better than me. What's the big deal? But there's so much information available, and we're so enamored of information, and that makes us think that information with scientific method, we should be able to answer everything, that when there's something that doesn't match how we thought it should be, right? So we thought Joseph Smith should be able to translate Egyptian, and we look and we say, first of all, he wasn't a linguist. He couldn't translate Egyptian. Everything he translated was by the gift and power of God. He doesn't necessarily fully understand that process. We don't have all the data available about what papyri is looking at and what he's doing with it, but we're used to having all the data available and being able to look at it, something, from 1,000 different camera angles, because there were 100 people with cameras at the place, right? That's what we're used to. And so when we encounter those questions, it makes us stumble more rather than being comfortable with saying, I don't understand this, but I've learned by means that I trust that Joseph Smith's an inspired translator. So he maybe didn't translate the way I preconceived, but he translated nonetheless.
Good. Well, I think I agree that secularism and scientism together have imposed upon us higher expectations of truth and closure and simplicity. I think also I would say part of the problem is a kind of set of cultural baggage that we've acquired that imposes upon the role of prophet higher standards of infallibility,
yes,
excellence in all matters, intellectual and spiritual, than prophets have ever claimed for themselves.
I agree.
And
I think some people would be uncomfortable by what I said earlier, which is Joseph Smith may have been mistaken in whether it was on the papyri or not.
Right.
That's because we don't want Joseph Smith to be human. But he wanted us to allow him to be human, and we owe him the courtesy of allowing that.
Right. So it seems that one of the neglected questions that hasn't received its due attention, instead of what did Joseph Smith know about Egyptian, should be what does Joseph Smith's product tell us about the depths and profundities of revelation that may sometimes be beyond our ken.
Yeah, that's well said.
Thank you. Thanks for your time with us today, Kerry. Appreciate it.
Thank you.